Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Now, who needs to be told that they're suffering from the effects of COVID-19? Well, nobody, I suspect, because we're all feeling the pain to some extent, not just in health terms, but in the way we live, in jobs, and so on, in our everyday lives. Is it time to ask how the global economic system got us here in the first place? You're watching Roundtable. Massive financial bailouts around the world to rich organizations that maybe landed us in this mess. If profit wasn't put before people, would the pandemic have been so bad?
The impact of coronavirus has been felt across the world, from our health to our social interactions. But the impact it is having on the economy is spreading far and wide, and some argue that the crisis is exposing flaws in our economic structures. The feeling is that the recovery since the crash of 2008 only papered over the cracks. COVID-19 has exacerbated a host of existing problems: ballooning private debt, lack of job security for millions of precarious workers, and the crumbling of public services through austerity measures. Doctors in the United Kingdom say there has been a 1.5 billion cut in public health spending since 2015. In the United States, total household debt before the current crisis was more than $14 trillion, $1.5 trillion higher than it was in 2008. As economist Mariana Mazzucato argues, we must avoid the mistakes of the post-2008 era, when bailouts allowed corporations to reap even higher profits once the crisis was over, but failed to lay the foundation for a robust and inclusive recovery. It's still uncertain how long this crisis will last, but is it time to shape a new economic system? And if not, who will suffer the most once it has all ended?
So let's begin the conversation in just a little while. We'll be hearing from Radhika Desai, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Manitoba. We go to London too to hear from Farwa Sial, postdoctoral researcher at the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester. But first, we welcome to the round table out of Berlin, Rainer Zittelmann, historian and author of The Power of Capitalism. And in Seattle, USA, we find Andrej Markovic, organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America. Herr Zittelmann, first of all, what is the power of capitalism?
Yes, if you think about what was 200 years ago, 90% of the people worldwide lived in extreme poverty, and today it's only 10%. And this is 200 years of capitalism. And what is more important than this, half of this reduction happened in the last 35 years. And I think it's a great story. Even if you look in China, where they introduced private property and more elements of a market economy. And 35 years ago, in times of socialism, 88% of the population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 1%. And I think these are good arguments for capitalism.
I think we'll leave China out of this and where it has got to in this particular age, in this time of coronavirus, for the moment, if we may. But let me put it to you this way. Capitalism got us to this point, didn't it? Because of the bank's failure, because of the economic collapses that then led to austerity, the cuts, the lacking of priorities on healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. We would not be in this mess were it not for the current system.
I don't understand the context. Sure, today some people blame capitalism for everything in the world, for all bad things that happened, but I can't see any connection. On the contrary, if you look who fought best against the coronavirus, these are the most capitalist countries in the world. There was, I think you're based in London, and from Deep Knowledge Institute some weeks ago, they published an index what countries fought best against coronavirus. And these were countries like Australia and New Zealand and Switzerland and Hong Kong and Singapore And these are all capitalist countries. Like,
but we might not have had the coronavirus crisis if we hadn't had the cuts that were caused by capitalism going wrong.
I don't. You have to explain this connection for me. I can't understand where the connection is.
Okay, let's go to Andrej and talk about this. Rainer can't see any connection between capitalism and the failure of the system and the world to prepare itself better for this pandemic at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, some people will contend that everything in the world that's gone wrong would be solved under some other system. That's obviously untrue. That's it's utopianism. But I think the argument that I would want to make is that instead of just being an emergency, which a pandemic like the coronavirus is, we're humans, we get sick. Pandemics have happened throughout history. But considering the amount of productive capacity that we have as a society, which has, capitalism has developed that productive capacity over the last 200 years. That's not, untrue. People have a higher standard of living than they have historically. But how are those resources and the products of that system allocated is a real question. And so instead of putting to use our productive capacity, our ability to the scientific advances we've had over the last hundreds of years, the ability to stockpile resources for emergencies. These are all kinds of things that advanced society should be able to do. And nonetheless, we are faced with catastrophe in many countries because we are lacking in essential medical protective equipment. We've known for years that we are running into problems with antibiotics no longer functioning, which is causing increased problems now with the infections that people get once they have coronavirus. We knew, a decade or more ago that we needed to work on vaccines for the SARS family of viruses, which coronavirus is related to.
Are you saying, sorry to cut you short, are you properly saying, are you really saying that capitalism is just too selfish?
It's certainly too short-sighted. Some people would say that it's human nature, and I would very much disagree with that. I think that capitalism as a system rewards and reinforces selfishness and a certain short-sightedness in the pursuit of profits. I mean, what is capitalism? It's a system that of distribution and production that is guided by profit-making. And so,
did capitalism lead us to the current crisis?
If we consider it to be the crisis of our response to, I don't want to argue that there would be no disease without capitalism, but our response, I think, is the crisis, and capitalism certainly set us up for a catastrophic response.
Okay, Rainer, let me read to you, and
yes,
Andrej, you can listen into this as well and respond. Quote from Richard D. Wolff, TV presenter for Economic Update. He's a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts. This is what he wrote. Capitalism had built up vulnerabilities to another crash that any number of possible triggers could unleash. The trigger this time was not the dot-com meltdown. It was not the subprime meltdown. It was a virus. And of course, mainstream ideology requires focusing on the trigger, the reason why it happened, not the vulnerability. In other words, not the consequences of it. Do you agree with what he says, Rainer?
I think this is a failure of state and not a failure of market economy. Look, for example, Bill Gates. He warned 5 years ago exactly from the situation that happens right now. And even look at the United States. I think the government was warned about the problem, but it's more that Donald Trump underestimated the problem. And this because he underestimated the problem, and not only Donald Trump, but as well politicians in a lot of other countries, like in UK and even here in Germany and I'm living in. So I think it's a failure of government. And I think the real problem today is that the state is very strong, for example, in the economy, where it should be weak, and the state is very weak, where it should be strong, for example, in crisis prevention. And I think this is the real problem. And so it has nothing to do with capitalism, but it's a failure of politicians and a failure of the state. And look about the priorities, for example, in the times of Barack Obama in the United States. I've been there in New York for a couple of months, and they discussed over the day, for example, for transgender restrooms and this kind of problems. And today, maybe they have enough transgender restrooms, but they don't have enough masks against the coronavirus, because the priority is wrong always with the state. And the state has to focus.
Well, let me throw that one to Andre. Rainer almost seems to be saying that capitalism is just in the background here, that it's governments that are making the mistakes. But do you see the two as being intrinsically linked?
Yeah, so I think it really what's clarifying for a lot of people right now is it's a very vivid crisis happening. Normally, a lot of what happens to most people, it happens behind the scenes. If you're not part of kind of the wealthy or reasonably well off, or the images that are depicted on most of our television programs, media, what happens to the working class around the world tends to be hidden. And now people are seeing it. And they're asking questions. Well, why can't we be paying people to stay home until we're able to make the world safer? Why aren't we shifting production into certain essential goods more quickly? And the answer to why that's not happening is that government isn't free to just do as it wants when it's dependent on investment and profits from the private sector, when it's dependent on campaign funding from largely the corporate sectors around the world. So we live in a capitalist, globalized capitalist world. And
let's go to Rainer on this one. It is the beneficiaries of the capitalist system who are safest in this crisis. They can afford to go onto their luxury yachts. We've seen pictures of them. It is, if you like, the subjugated, the working classes, those who some consider to be downtrodden, who are most vulnerable to this. So how can you defend a system that allows that to be the case?
Look, if you criticize capitalism, I'm always asking for the alternative. And if you look back in the last 100 years, we tried so often alternatives to capitalism system in every way. In Soviet Union, another way than as in China. In Cuba, in another way as maybe in UK with democratic socialism. They tried socialism in every way you could try. And it failed all the time. There's no exception. If I ask you, I think you're an organizer of a democratic socialist here in the United States, but if I ask you, tell me only one example where an alternative to capitalism, a socialist alternative, worked in the last 100 years. It never worked. And I think if it never worked, it always failed without any exception. And so, but maybe you can give me one example.
Well, we'll give Andre the opportunity to respond, but I think it's really a rhetorical question. And we don't have very much time in this segment left, but the floor is yours, Andre.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would even say that the nations, going back to the original point of which that supposedly it's capitalist nations who have responded the best. Those that have done well have, for one reason or another, have some form of a welfare state for people to fall back on to actually marshal these resources.
You can have the two things side by side. You have a welfare state in the United Kingdom and you have a capitalist system. I'm going to have to ask you both to take your leave now. We thank you very much indeed for being on the program, putting two very different points of view. Rainer, thank you. Andre, thank you. And good to have you on Roundtable. I am very pleased to say that joining us now on the panel, we have in Winnipeg, Canada, Radhika Desai, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Manitoba, and in London, Farwa Sial, postdoctoral researcher at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, currently working on a paper about COVID-19 and capitalism. Radhika, let me come to you first of all. You've said this pandemic has only accelerated an overdue crisis. Was that a crisis, in your opinion, caused by capitalism?
Absolutely. I mean, it was very clear well before the pandemic hit that all sorts of changes were taking place, which were indicating that capitalism was in deep trouble. You had already stock markets anticipating a turndown. You had the record resignation of a huge number of corporate CEOs, something that only happens on the eve of a recession, because corporate CEOs know better than anyone else how their companies are doing and what the prognosis looks like, and so on. You also had various other things, the slowing down of trade growth, the increasing domestication of economies. So in a number of different ways, there were problems brewing within capitalism.
Yeah, but how do the two things relate? The pandemic itself and what you consider to be the crumbling of the capitalist foundations?
Absolutely. So the key word here is acceleration. What the pandemic has done is it has accelerated a whole range of trends that were already in train well before the pandemic hit. And in this, we would also include the acceleration of the political crisis, because in the context of the pandemic, we are all watching the incompetence of various governments, the antics of Donald Trump, etc. But the fact of the matter is that figures like Trump and Johnson were only elected because the underlying political system was already in crisis, thanks to the accumulated problems of neoliberalism, which had become particularly acute over the last decade or 12 or so years, where the cost of socializing the debt that was undertaken, state debt, essentially the private debt became socialized in the context of the bailouts. And as a result, austerity was imposed across the Western world, and the protest against this had already produced the Trumps and the Johnsons and so on.
Well, and this was a point I was trying to get across with our pro-capitalism guest in the first half of the program. He didn't buy my suggestions, but how about this? You talk about neoliberals. Noam Chomsky, libertarian socialist, fair enough, considered a key intellectual figure in the United States. He said this. One lesson is that it's another colossal failure of the neoliberal version of capitalism, massive failure. If we don't learn that lesson, it's going to recur worse next time. You have a think about that one, Radhika. And Fawa, I will come to you on this one. You are investigating any possible links there may be between COVID-19 and capitalism. What have you found out so far?
Well, I very much agree with what Radhika is saying. I think a lot of people are trying to understand the crisis as something ad hoc, something which came out of nowhere. And I really like Sonia Shah's book on this, in which she calls this microbial xenophobia. Basically, the idea being that the microbe or the virus came from nowhere. And this is a flawed assumption, obviously, because it's very much part of the way the agro-industrial capitalism is structured. So the point at which the outbreak becomes a pandemic, that is how we need to analyze it. And just echoing Radhika again, there are three ways in which we can think about how this crisis accelerates the ongoing situation, which is the fact that the factors which predated the 2008 financial crisis were never addressed. So you have an ongoing decline in labor income, which basically means that household spending is decreasing. Aggregate demand is reduced drastically, especially as the welfare state is in decline. Add to that, we have massive privatization and austerity as the macroeconomic default position. A lot of OECD governments.
And all of this goes back to a bat in Wuhan, does it?
It's just Wuhan is just one epicenter where it happened. I don't think we can just isolate China into that and just.
No, I suppose what I'm trying to say is the austerity cuts, etc., should left people perhaps more vulnerable. But the pandemic might have happened anyway because of a bat in a wet market in China. It's not necessarily capitalism's fault that it occurred in the first place.
It's not capitalism's fault per se that it happened at this point, but it was inevitable that under a capitalist system, this crisis would eventually culminate. We now know that epidemiologists have been talking about it for a very long time, and they actually predicted that the crisis would come in 10 to 20 or 50 years, but actually it just happened very quickly. And I think one of the biggest, the ironies of this situation is that planners, politicians, technocrats, government bureaucrats were not doing anything about it. In fact, a leading figure who had been talking about it was Bill Gates, which actually goes to show the kind of situation that we're in right now.
Bill Gates is a philanthropist capitalist, so maybe we should thank him and at the same time perhaps condemn him in the eyes of many for being a capitalist. Sorry, Radhika, you were going to say.
Yeah, I'd also like to, I mean, I concur with Farah that, this is a capitalist crisis in the sense, and I would actually go a little bit further, and I would say that the particular types of farming practices that have been practiced, particularly the sort of factory farming we do, massing vast numbers of animals in very, very cramped conditions, this has already been pointed to by various epidemiologists as a particular source of zoonotic viruses. And also what capitalist farming does is it induces a loss of habitat among wild animals so that they are increasingly making incursions into territories in which we live. On the whole, we find this very cute, but on the other hand, it also has these other consequences. So definitely it implicates capitalism. I'd like to say one other thing which is about Bill Gates and about pandemic preparedness and about the warnings we had already had. So first of all, definitely I think that Bill Gates had been warning about this, but we also have to bear in mind that he is warning about this because he represents in many ways the interests of the pharmaceutical industry, which stands to make millions if states can be convinced to adopt massive vaccinations, etc., etc. So while, of course...
But aren't you damned if you do and damned if you don't? I mean, he makes a lot of money and then he's spending a lot of money to try and get us out of this mess. Let's go back to Noam Chomsky, who said it's going to be worse next time unless lessons are learned.
Yeah, but in order to understand what Chomsky is saying, let me take one other step back. The other crisis, the other reason why the pandemic has accelerated the crisis of capitalism is that it has shown the bankruptcy of capitalism. No matter what system you have, it should be able to ensure the basic health and safety of ordinary people in that country. And not only Farah has pointed out that we have had particularly since the beginning of the 21st century, but going back to the 1980s with AIDS and whatnot, we have had many warnings about pandemics of various sorts. And these warnings have not only been ignored, but in more recent years, in the austerity decade, the preparations have been reduced even more. In that context, let's also examine the pattern difference between the response in China on the one hand, which was able to mobilize state and social resources and political resources to completely contain the epidemic within one province.
Well, okay, well, let us see whether that is the case when we take a long and detailed look at it in the aftermath of all of this. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go back to Farha and say you've written another paper about the rise of state capitalism. How does that fit into this argument?
So yes, I think we see a very interesting resurgence of what can be termed as state capitalism. That is the rise of state intervention from China to many countries in Africa to Asia. And this is manifest in the form of sovereign wealth funds, nationalization at some point, or a general intervention in markets. And I think this is a response to what Radhika just called a failure of capitalism to regulate itself. Some countries are better prepared to do that, and while others are not. But I think to just say that state capitalism is here and neoliberalism is not, that is not the position I hold, because at the same time, when you have this reactionary rise of the state, you also have neoliberal tendencies. So if we look at the global market, it's a very chaotic sort of collide of state capitalism on the one hand and neoliberal forces on the other hand, and philanthropy capitalism.
Can I read something to both of you? Can I read this? This is from Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, talking to my daughter A Brief History of Capitalism. And he writes this. This might amuse you. Have I ever told you why I became an economist? Because I refused to leave it to the experts. The more I understood the economist theories and mathematics, the more I realized that the so-called experts in our great universities, on our TV screens, in the banks and finance ministries did not have a clue. The whole point is that everything regarding this is an inexact science. We really don't know where it's going to go. Radhika, final thoughts?
Well, final thoughts very quickly. I think that the economists have certainly been wrong, because the economists really had their field day in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism, where the previously reformed form of capitalism was increasingly unreformed and let loose and unleashed, as some people would say. And this is the point to which it has brought us.
Farwa, final thought from you.
Final thoughts. Well, first of all, one point: the pandemic is showing us a very uncertain time. We're not sure how long it will last. We're not sure what the post-COVID world look like. But what's happening in terms of state response is very problematic. We're seeing a lot of rescue packages for corporations, for companies, for instead of households. And this brings us back to the situation which we're trying to run away from. So this needs to be the center of analysis right now, I think.
Which was where we started the program before you were able to join us. Listen, I appreciate it very much indeed. Perhaps the only experts we should believe at the moment are the medical experts when it comes to our own personal safety, but even they don't know for sure. Listen, thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Farwa. Great to have you on the program, and thank you very much indeed for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the entire team, stay safe, stay well, stay with us if you can.